I thank my colleagues. This will be my final remarks to the Senate. And I thought I would share with my colleagues my observations on what has just occurred and to put in perspective where I believe we are and where we're headed, and to lay down a challenge to my colleagues as I depart, because a very significant challenge remains for the Congress and the country, and I hope very much that we find the courage to take these challenges on. It's critically important to the future strength of our nation, and we can do it. We've done much tougher things in the past. We can certainly take on these challenges. Mr. President, New Year's Eve, we were called to session, and we were briefed by the Vice President and other staff from the White House with respect to the deal that was before us. I told our colleagues on that night that I believed we had to support the proposal before us, because to fail to do so would send us back into a recession. Most economists say the economy would shrink 4% in the first quarter, 2% in the second quarter, that 1 million more people would be unemployed, that 2 million people who are now on unemployment insurance would lose that and would have no safety net. So, Mr. President, I saw no alternative but to support this agreement. At the same time, I told my colleagues, I hate this agreement. I hate it with every fiber of my being, because this is not the grand bargain that I hoped for or worked for or believed is so necessary to the future of the country. Mr. President, this is not by any standard a deficit reduction plan. As necessary as it is, no one should be misled that this deals with our deficit and debt, because it only makes our debt circumstance worse. Now, some question that assessment, but that is precisely the assessment that the Congressional Budget Office has come to. And I would like to, Mr. President, take just a few moments to put in perspective where we are. The United States is borrowing 31 cents of every dollar that it spends. That is an unsustainable circumstance. It's improved somewhat because we were borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that we spend. So there's been some modest improvement. But Mr. President, this cannot go on. It has to be addressed, or we will weaken the nation. This chart puts in perspective the spending and revenue of the United States going back to 1950. So looking back 60 years, the red line is the spending line, the green line is the revenue line, and you can see that our spending is close to a 60-year high. We're not quite at a 60-year high because there's been some improvement in the last 2 years, and we're close to a 60-year low on revenue. So our colleagues that say this is just a spending problem, I think are missing the point. This is a problem of the relationship between spending and revenue. The gap, much higher spending than we have revenue, is what leads to deficits and leads to additions to the debt. The path that we are on, we are told by the Congressional Budget Office, will take us from a debt of 104% of our gross domestic product today, this is the gross debt of the United States, to 115% by 2022 if we fail to act. Well, Mr. President, further action is absolutely essential. Why? Why does it matter if our debt, our gross debt, is more than 100% of our gross domestic product? Well, because the best work that has been done on this question by Rogoff and Reinhardt concluded, after looking at 200 years of economic history, the following. I quote from their study. We examined the experience of 44 countries spanning up to 2 centuries of data and central government debt, inflation, and growth. Our main finding is that across both advanced countries and emerging markets, high debt to GDP levels, 90% and above, are associated with notably lower growth outcomes. To sum it up, Mr. President, when you have a debt, a gross debt of more than 90% of your GDP, you are headed down a path that dramatically reduces your future economic growth. That means we are reducing future economic opportunity for the people of our country. Mr. President, that is why this matters, because it will retard and restrict economic growth and opportunity for our people. And here's what the Congressional Budget Office tells us is the long-term path that we are on. We're already over 100% of our GDP in gross debt. But the CBO tells us we are headed for a circumstance that the debt will be 200% of our GDP. And by the way, Mr. President, this is not gross debt. This is the publicly held debt. Gross debt is even higher, about 30 points higher than the publicly held debt. So, Mr. President, we are on a course that is utterly unsustainable. If we look at what's been done, because those who say nothing has been done are not giving the full story either. The fact is, we passed the Budget Control Act. In place of a budget, we put in place a law in place of a budget resolution. That budget law dropped discretionary spending to historic lows. We were at, in this year, 8.3% of GDP going to domestic spending. The Budget Control Act, the law that was passed, will take that down to 5.3% of GDP going for discretionary spending. That is an historic low. So anybody who says nothing has been done, that's really not accurate. We cut domestic spending and cut it in a very significant way, cut it to a level that will be an historic low. But that doesn't mean the problem has been solved. Nowhere close to it. Because at the same time, the non-discretionary accounts are rising dramatically. Medicare, Medicaid, other federal health spending are the 800-pound gorilla. That's where we see such a dramatic increase in spending, both in real terms and nominal terms and a share of GDP. Back in 1972, these healthcare accounts consumed 1.1% of our gross domestic product. 1.1%. By 2050, if we don't do something, they will consume 12.4%. Now, Mr. President, that is totally unsustainable. It is gobbling up bigger and bigger chunks of our budget, putting increasing pressure on deficits and debt, and eating up the ability of the United States to have the flexibility to respond to crises that might occur. And the aging population is a primary driver of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security cost growth. You can see in this chart the effect of cost growth is the yellow part of this chart. The effect of aging is the red part, and the spending in absence of aging and excess cost growth is the green part of this chart. In other words, our spending on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security would actually be very stable absent the effect of aging and the effect of excess cost growth. And now the effect of aging has become the biggest driver. Nothing we can do about that because these people have been born. They're alive today. They're going to be eligible for Medicare and Social Security. And we're going to have to find a way to be able to afford this combined effect. Mr. President, the revenue side of the equation, I think, is critically important to understand. We have many of our colleagues who say, well, it's true that we are at a very low share of GDP going to revenue today. Less than 16% of our GDP is coming as revenue to the federal government. Typically, it is about 18.5% of GDP. But Mr. President, if we look back on the last 5 times we've actually balanced the budget around here, revenue hasn't been 18 or 18.5% of GDP. The last 5 times we've balanced the budget, revenue has been 19.7% of GDP, 19.9, 19.8, 20.6, 19.5. So those who say, well, we just have to get back to the normal revenue stream, the average, I think missed the point. The average is not going to do it. It never has, at least going back to 1969. Mr. President, we're going to have more revenue. At the same time, we have more spending discipline with respect to especially the health care accounts. And we need fundamental tax reform. This tax code is out of date, it's inefficient, it's hurting U.S. global competitiveness. The complexity imposes a significant burden on individuals and businesses. The expiring provisions create uncertainty and confusion. It's hemorrhaging revenue to tax gap, tax havens, abusive tax shelters. I've shown many times on the floor of the Senate a picture of a little 5-story building in the Cayman Islands called Udland House. Udland House claims to be the home to 18,000 companies, little 5-story building. Claims to be the home of 18,000 companies, all say they're doing business out of that building. I've said many times that's the most efficient building in the world. How can 18,000 companies be doing business out of a little 5-story building down the Cayman Islands? They're not doing business out of that building. The only business they are doing is monkey business. And the monkey business they're doing is to avoid the taxes they owe in the United States through shell games in which they show their profits in the Cayman Islands where happily there are no income taxes to impose on those earnings. So they're avoiding showing their income here and putting it in the Cayman Islands where they can shield it from taxation. We also desperately need to restore fairness. The current system contributes to growing income inequality. I don't know how anyone can conclude otherwise. You know, I've shown also many times on the floor of the Senate the report on one building on Park Avenue, New York, where the average income is $1.1 million of the people who live in that building. And the average tax rate that those people are paying is about 14%, 14%. The janitor in that building is paying a tax rate of 24% with an income of $33,000 a year. How is that fair? How can that possibly be considered fair? And these long-term fiscal imbalances simply must be addressed, and revenue is going to have to be part of the solution. Mr. President, Martin Feldstein, one of the distinguished economists in our country, conservative, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Reagan, said this about the tax expenditures of the country, because we are spending in the tax expenditures category of the United States $1.2 trillion a year. We are spending more through the tax code than we are through all of the appropriated accounts. You know, people say we're spending too much. Yes, we continue to have a spending problem and a revenue problem, but we are also spending through the tax code. We spend more there than we spend through all of the appropriated accounts. Here's what Martin Feldstein said about the need to reduce tax expenditures. He said, cutting tax expenditures is really the best way to reduce government spending. Eliminating tax expenditures does not increase marginal tax rates or reduce the reward for saving, investment, or risk-taking. It would also increase overall economic efficiency by removing incentives that distort private spending decisions. And eliminating or consolidating the large number of overlapping tax-based subsidies would also greatly simplify tax filing. In short, cutting tax expenditures is not at all like other ways of raising revenue. I'd say to my colleagues, we're going to have to raise more revenue, even after what has just happened. We're going to have to raise more revenue. We're going to have to cut spending. We're going to have to reform entitlements. It's as clear as it can be that those things are going to have to be done to get the country back on track. And here's one of the most distinguished economists in the country telling us that reforming tax expenditures is not like other ways of raising revenue in terms of its economic effect. Mr. President, I think Mr. Feldstein has that exactly right. And by the way, who most benefits from these tax expenditures? Well, here's a chart that shows the increase in after-tax income from tax expenditures. And here's the top 1%. On average, they benefit per year by over $250,000. Mr. President, the next quintile benefit by $32,000. The lowest quintile benefits by tax expenditures by $707 a year. Wow, what an extraordinary disparity. The lowest quintile tax expenditures benefit $707 a year. The top 1%, their benefit from tax expenditures, on average, over $250,000 a year. Mr. President, here we are, borrowing 31 cents of every dollar we spend. We're on a course taking the debt of the United States from over 100% of our gross domestic product to over 200% if we fail to act. Mr. President, that's why we had the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. And the report that we put out was called The Moment of Truth. Mr. President, what we called for in that report was $5.4 trillion in deficit reduction. If we used the current baseline, that's what we would have provided, $5.4 trillion in deficit reduction. We lowered the deficit to 1.4% of GDP in 2022. We stabilized the gross debt by 2015. We reduced discretionary spending to 4.8% of GDP by 2022. We build on the health reform savings. We called for Social Security reform and savings to be used only to extend the solvency of Social Security itself. And we also included fundamental tax reform that raised revenue and did it in part by reducing those tax expenditures I just referred to. Mr. President, here's what would happen to the deficit as a percentage of GDP under the Fiscal Commission budget plan. You can see 2012 deficit 7.6% of GDP. It was taken down to 1.4% of GDP under the plan. Mr. President, here's what would happen to the gross debt of the country as a percentage of GDP under the Fiscal Commission plan. From 104% of GDP in 2012 down to 93% of GDP in 2022. Stabilize the debt, then begin to bring it down. That ought to be our challenge. Mr. President, the plan that was just passed took individual rate increases from 35 to 39.6 for couples earning over $450,000. Capital gains and dividends were increased from 15% to 20%. PEP and Ps were reinstated. The estate tax was increased to 40% for those estates above $5 million. The alternative minimum tax was patched on a permanent basis to prevent 30 million people from being caught up in the alternative minimum tax. It extended other expiring provisions. On the spending side, the doc fix was put in place for 1 year to prevent doctors who provide care for Medicare-eligible beneficiaries from taking a 28% cut. It turned off the sequester for 2 months, the $1.2 trillion across-the-board cut in discretionary spending, both defense and non-defense. It provided for a 1-year extension of unemployment benefits and also for a 1-year extension of the Farm Bill. Mr. President, again, while I believe that plan had to be supported, and I did, albeit reluctantly, because I think if we had failed to support it, we'd be headed back into recession. An additional 1 million people would have lost their jobs. The unemployment rate would be headed to 9.1%, and 2 million people would have lost their unemployment benefits. So there was good reason to support that plan. But Mr. President, I want to end as I began. I hated that plan. I hated it with every fiber of my being, because the truth is, it increased the debt of the United States. And that's just not my word. That's the word of the Congressional Budget Office that tells me the revenue loss from that plan is $3.6 trillion. The new spending, $332 billion. The total impact on the deficit and debt, $4 trillion, and that doesn't account for the additional debt service, which is another $650 billion. So the total increase in the debt as a result of that plan is over $4.6 trillion. So don't let anybody tell you that was a deficit reduction plan or a plan to deal with the debt, because it was not and it is not, and that leaves the unresolved challenge of our time. Because for this nation's future, it is critically important. It is critically important that the next Congress, in its early days, try to get back to doing the grand bargain, the big deal, something that would reduce our deficits and debt by at least $4 trillion over the next 10 years, to stabilize the debt, to begin to bring it down. Mr. President, I'll leave here in many ways with a heavy heart, because I came here 26 years ago believing one of the foremost responsibilities of a senator was to guide the fiscal affairs of this country. I'd like at this point just to enter into the record the announcement speech I made in 1986 in running for the United States Senate.
Without objection.
Let me just read a couple of paragraphs from that, but I'd like the whole statement entered in the record. This is what I said 26 years ago in my candidacy for the United States Senate. I've concluded that the serious economic problems facing our state can in large measure only be addressed in Washington. It's economic policies decided in our nation's capital that are pushing our state into a difficult financial position. Since 1980, our national debt has doubled, our national operating deficit has tripled, our trade deficit has increased sixfold, and we've become a debtor nation for the first time in 71 years. We can do better. We must do better. And we will do better if we have the courage and leadership to move this country in a new direction. Current economic policies, which have increased the national debt in 5 years by an amount that had taken 200 years to accumulate, have forced record-high real interest rates. Those record-high real interest rates have bloated the value of the American dollar, which in turn has put a hidden tax on every commodity exported by our state and nation. That hidden tax has robbed us of our export markets and dramatically reduced our commodity values. Those economic policies are not only devastating to the economy of the state of North Dakota, but are rapidly exporting the economic strength of our country. This process must be stopped. And I said in the next paragraph, and I'll end here, but I'll put the full statement in the record, it is time for politicians to stop posturing and promising and start guaranteeing performance and results. And then I made a pledge. I pledge today that if elected, the federal deficit, the trade deficit, real interest rates will be brought under control, or I will not seek re-election in 1992. That was a statement I made 26 years ago. Some people are probably wondering, if you made that pledge, how are you still here? Well, 6 years after I made that pledge, I announced I wouldn't seek re-election, and I did not. I announced in April of that year I would not seek re-election. Congressman Dorgan was nominated to run for my seat, and I thought I was leaving the United States Senate. Then the other senator from North Dakota died in September of that year. The governor called me and said, "Senator, you got to run to fill out the 2 years of his term, because our state is going to lose all of its seniority in one fell swoop. All of Senator Burdick's seniority, all of your seniority, all of Congressman Dorgan's seniority. We will be the only state in the nation with no seniority. You'll have kept your pledge. You didn't seek re-election. You will run in a special election, which will be in December after the regular elections in November." And I'll never forget, one of the news media stations back home did a poll, and 2/3 of Republicans thought I should run to fill out the 2 years of that term, which I did, which means I am the answer to a trivia question, because I'm the only senator in history that served in both Senate seats from the same state in the same day. But Mr. President, I believed then and I believe now that fiscal responsibility is one of the first obligations of government. And my deep regret, my greatest regret in leaving here, is we have not been able to fashion the grand bargain to put us back on track. Mr. President, I'll ask that that statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Then, Mr. President, I also ask unanimous consent to have a tribute to the Budget Committee staff that have served so ably and so well, served this body, served our country, led by my staff director, Mary Naylor, who is truly a remarkable person. I consider her a real patriot because she has absolutely dedicated herself to getting the fiscal affairs of the country in order. So if I could put in the record a tribute to all of the Budget Committee staff that have served with me so ably and so well.
Without objection.
And I would also like to mention my personal staff. Sarah Garland, my Chief of Staff, really an extraordinary person, North Dakota native, somebody who has dedicated herself to public service. Jerry Gaginas, my Executive Assistant, who has been with me more than 20 years, also a North Dakota native. We call her Mom in our office because she does a good job of keeping us all on track. Tracy Sutton, my Legislative Director, also a North Dakota native, exceptional person. She will be on the staff of my succeeding colleague, Senator-elect Heitkamp. Susan King, also North Dakota native, who has been with me off and on for many years, really an outstanding person. Barry Pyatt, my communications director, with me here at the end. Mary Jo Prouty, my office manager, still laboring to close down our office. Molly Spaeth, also with me right here to the final days. And I also want to give special recognition to Sean Neary, who was my communications director for many years, who is now the communications director of the Finance Committee, truly an extraordinary person. And with that, Mr. President, I want to thank Stu Nagurka. Stu, who is my communications director in the Finance Committee, has stayed with me right to the end. Somebody who has an extraordinary record in government service, in fact, served your own Bill Richardson, governor of New Mexico, when he was in public service here in Washington. Stu was his communications director and did, I think as everyone knows, an outstanding job. His son, I want to note, is our page. Jared Nagurka called back into service because in these days, you know, we're a little short of people. They have been people who I have the highest regard for. Stu Nagurka, Jared. I mentioned Mary Naylor, my extraordinary staff director, John Reiter, the deputy, but I've mentioned and gone into detail on all of my Budget Committee staff in this statement that made part of the record. Finally, Mr. President, let me note that my colleague on the Budget Committee, Senator Sessions, is here. Senator Sessions has been the ranking Republican. He has been a gentleman. He has been somebody that I have enjoyed working with. He and his staff have been professional. I think we put on a series of hearings that laid out the issues for our country in a clear and undeniable way. Again, I leave with only one true regret, and that is we were not able collectively to put in place a plan to get our country back on track. But I'm not without hope, because next year, this year, later this year, we'll have more opportunities to do what needs to be done. I thank the chair and yield the floor.